A tea party at night on the road to revolution. Today we tell about the start of the American colonies war for independence from Britain in the late 1700s. The road to revolution lasts several years. The most serious event began in 1770. War began 5 years later. Relations between Britain and its American colonies were most tense in the colony of Massachusetts. There were protests against the British policy of taxing the colonies without giving them representation in Parliament. To prevent trouble, thousands of British soldiers were sent to Boston, the biggest city in Massachusetts. On March 5, 1770, tension led to violence. This is what happened. It was the end of winter, and the weather was very cold. A small group of colonists began throwing rocks and pieces of ice at soldiers guarding a public building. They were joined by others, and the soldiers became frightened. They fired their guns. 5 colonists were killed. The incident became known as the Boston Massacres. The people of Massachusetts were extremely angry. The soldiers were tried in court for murder. Most were found innocent. The others received minor punishment. Fearing more violence, the British Parliament cancelled most of its taxes. Only the tax on tea remained. This erased some of the tension for a while. Imports of British goods increased. The colonies seemed satisfied with the situation until a few years later. That is when the Massachusetts colony once again became involved in a dispute with Britain. The trouble started because the British government wanted to help improve the business of British East India Company. That company organized all the trade between India and other countries ruled by Britain. By 1773, the company had become weak. The British government decided to permit it to sell tea directly to the American colonies. The colonies would still have to pay a tea tax to Britain. The Americans did not like the new plan. They felt they were being forced to buy their tea from the only one company. Officials in the colonies of Pennsylvania and New York sent the East India Company ship back to Britain. In Massachusetts, things were different. The British governor there wanted to collect the tea tax and enforce the law. When the ships arrived in Boston, some colonists tried to block their way. The ships remained just outside the harbor without unloading their goods. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists went out in a small boat. They got on a British ship and threw all the tea into the water. The colonists were dressed as American Indians, so the British would not recognize them, but the people of Boston knew who they were. A crowd gathered to cheer them. That incident, the night when British tea was thrown into Boston Harbor, became known as Boston Tea Party. Destroying the tea was a serious crime. The British government was angry. Parliament reacted to the Boston Tea Party by punishing the whole country, the whole colony of Massachusetts, for the action of a few men. It approved a series of laws that once again changed relations between the colony and Britain. One of these laws closes the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. Other laws strengthened the power of the British governor and weakened the power of local colonial officials. In June 1774, the colony of Massachusetts called for a meeting of delegates from all the other colonies to consider joint action against Britain. This meeting of colonial delegates was called the First Continental Congress. It was held in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in September 1774. All the colony except one was represented. The southern colony of Georgia did not send a delegate. The delegates agreed that the British Parliament had no right to control trade with the American colonies or to make any law that affected them. They said the people of the colony must have the right to take part in any legislative group that make laws for them. The First Continental Congress approved a series of documents that condemned all British action in the American colony after 1763. It approved a Massachusetts proposal saying that the people could use weapons to defend their rights. It also recognized a continental association to boycott British goods and to stop all export to any British colony or to Britain itself. Local communities were created to enforce the boycott. One of the delegates to this First Continental Congress was John Adams of Massachusetts. Many years later, he said that by the time the meeting was held, the American Revolution had already begun. British King George II announced that the New England colony were in rebellion. Parliament made the decision to use troops against Massachusetts in January 1775. The peoples of Massachusetts formed a provincial assembly and began training men to fight. Groups of armed men were doing military exercise in towns of around Massachusetts and in other colonies too. British officers received their order in April 1775. By that time, the colonists had been gathering weapons in the town of Concord, about 30 kilometers west of Boston. The British force were ordered to seize the weapons, but the colonists knew they were coming and were prepared. Years later, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about what happened. The poem tells about the action of Paul Reveries, one of three men who had warned the colonial troops that the British were coming. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 1705, hardly a man is now alive who remembered that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folks to be up and to arm. When the British reached the town of Lexington, they found it protected by about 70 colonial troops. These troops were called Minutemen because they had been trained to fight with only a minute warning. Guns were fired, 8 colonies were killed. No one knows who fired the first shot in that first battle of American Revolution. Each side accused the other, but the meaning was very clear. It was called the Shoot Hard Round the War. From Lexington, the British marched to Concord, where they destroyed whatever supply the colonies had not been able to save. Other colonial troops rushed to the area, a battle to Concord. North Brit forced the British to march back to Boston. It was the first day of America's War for Independence. When it was over, almost 300 British troops had been killed. Fewer than 100 Americans had died. British troops had marched in time with their drummer and piper. The musician had played a song called Yankee Doodle. The British invented the song to insult the American. They said Yankee Doodle was a man who did not know how to fight. After the early battle of the Revolution, the Americans said they were glad to be Yankee Doodle. Following the battle at Lexington and Concord, the Massachusetts government organized groups that captured Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in New York State. The other colonies began sending troops to help, and another joint colonial meeting was called the Second Continental Congress. This will be our next story. Today, Making of a Nation program was written by Nancy Sarah Long.